The doors of the Redemption Creek Town Hall burst open with a force that rattled the oil lanterns hanging from the raftered ceiling, and every head in that crowded room turned to see Louis Morgan stride through them like a man walking into a fire. He had no intention of fleeing. Dust rose from his boots with each heavy step. His jaw was set hard as iron ore, his dark eyes scanning the faces of the 7 men seated behind the long oak council table, and the air in that room grew thick enough to choke on before he even opened his mouth. Harlan Voss sat at the center of the council, fat fingers laced across his belly, a smile on his face that never once touched his eyes. Beside him sat his 2 boatmen, Councilmen Prout and Deakins, and beside them the rest who owed Harlan Voss something they could not afford to repay. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, shopkeepers, hired hands, and the women of Redemption Creek who had come to watch the verdict fall on Naomi Keller's land like an executioner's axe. Naomi herself sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that cost her everything she had. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a worn felt hat and eyes the color of creek water in the shade of a cottonwood. Those eyes were dry, though everything behind them was not. She had been fighting this battle for 3 weeks now, since the day Voss had sent his lawyers riding out to the Keller homestead with papers that declared her grandfather's land claim null and void on a technicality so thin it barely deserved the paper it was printed on. Voss had spoken for 20 minutes, his lawyer for 15 more. The council had listened with the attentiveness of men who had already decided, and when the chairman had opened his mouth to deliver the verdict, the doors had opened instead. Louis Morgan walked straight to the front of that room, and he turned, and he faced the council without apology, without hat in hand, without a single word of deference to the power arranged before him, and he said it loud enough that the words rang off the back wall and settled into the bones of every person present. Her grandfather filed that claim, and it stands today. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Harlan Voss unfolded his hands and leaned forward, his chair creaking beneath him. "Morgan, you have no standing before this council. This is a legal proceeding." "Then let's talk law," Louis said, and he reached into the front pocket of his canvas work coat and pulled out a folded document, its edges worn soft with handling. He set it on the council table with the flat of his hand and pushed it toward the chairman. Elias Keller filed that homestead claim in the spring of 1871 with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, witnessed, stamped, and recorded in the Territorial Register. I have the copy right there. Now you are going to tell me where in the laws of this territory or this nation a man's granddaughter loses that claim because Harlan Voss has decided he wants the water rights sitting underneath it. Naomi's breath left her body so fast she almost made a sound. She had not known Louis Morgan would come. She had not asked him to come. She had not spoken more than 12 words to the man in the past year, and most of those had been words exchanged across a fence line about a steer that had wandered from his pasture to hers. She had believed until 30 seconds ago that she was entirely alone in that room. She was wrong. Now she needed to understand how wrong, and why, and what it meant that the most private and self-contained man in Redemption Creek had walked into that hall and planted himself between her and the most powerful one. But that story did not begin today. It began almost exactly 2 years prior, on a Thursday morning in early April of 1879, when the frost still clung to the low ground at sunrise, and the sky over the Wyoming territory was the particular shade of pale blue that looks too fragile to last. Naomi Keller had arrived in Redemption Creek on the stage from Laramie with 2 trunks, a leather satchel, and the deed to 160 acres that her grandfather Elias had deeded to her mother and which had passed, after the deaths of both her parents in a scarlet fever outbreak, to Naomi herself. She was the last Keller living. She had grown up in St. Louis, educated at a school run by Methodist women, and she had never set foot on the Wyoming land that bore her family's claim. She had sold everything she owned in Missouri, packed what she could carry, and come west because the alternative was to let the land be absorbed by neglect or seized by default, and she would not do either. The town of Redemption Creek was a single main street flanked by false-fronted buildings, a church, a livery, 2 saloons, a general mercantile run by a woman named Agnes Pollard who had opinions about everything, a land office, a bank, and a hotel called the Criterion that had seen better days sometime around 1873. The population was perhaps 300 souls, swelling to 400 during cattle season when the drovers came through. Naomi had climbed down from the stage with dust on her coat and a straight spine, and asked directions to the land office, and the first person to answer her had been Agnes Pollard herself, who had stepped out of the mercantile to eyeball the new arrival the way she eyeballed everything that came through Redemption Creek that might affect the social fabric of the place. "Land office is 2 doors down," Agnes had said. "You buying or filing?" "Confirming," Naomi had said. "My grandfather's homestead." Agnes had looked at her the way a woman looks at another woman she is deciding whether to like. "Elias Keller's granddaughter. You knew him." Everybody knew Elias, good man, hard worker, died 4 years back, God rest him. Agnes had paused. "You are going to have trouble." "I generally find trouble wherever I go," Naomi had said pleasantly, and Agnes Pollard had decided right then that she liked her. The trouble Agnes had referred to had a name, and its name was Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss owned the largest cattle operation in the county, a spread of 12,000 acres called the Double V Ranch, and his ambition was not satisfied by 12,000. He had been methodically acquiring land in the valley for the better part of a decade, sometimes through purchase, sometimes through the kind of legal pressure that looked legitimate from a distance and rotted when you got close enough to smell it. The Keller homestead sat on 160 acres of the most coveted ground in that valley, because directly beneath its southern pasture ran the Redemption Creek itself, the only reliable water source within 6 miles that did not dry up in August. Harlan Voss had wanted that water for years. He had offered Elias Keller money 3 times and been refused 3 times, and the old man had died before Voss could make a 4th offer. The land had sat in legal limbo while the territorial courts sorted out inheritance across state lines, and in that limbo Voss had been very busy indeed. Naomi had discovered the scope of his maneuvering on her 3rd day in Redemption Creek, when she had sat down at the land office with a territorial clerk named Horace Bell and gone through the records. And Horace Bell, who was an honest man laboring under the thumb of a dishonest one, had told her in very careful and heavily qualified language that certain questions had been raised about the validity of the original filing owing to a discrepancy in the witness signatures on the 1871 document. "What sort of discrepancy?" Naomi had asked. Horace Bell had coughed and looked out the window. "Mr. Voss's lawyer argues that one of the 2 required witnesses was not a resident of the territory at the time of filing." "Was that true?" Another cough. "It is a matter of considerable interpretation." Naomi had walked out of the land office and stood in the April wind and looked at the mountains to the west and thought very hard about the choices in front of her. She could hire a lawyer, which would cost money she did not yet have. She could appeal to the county council, which was partially composed of men who owed Harlan Voss favors. She could write to the federal land office in Cheyenne and wait months for a reply. Or she could do what her grandfather had done when he had first come to this valley with nothing but a surveying chain and a determination to build something that would last. She could go to work. She had gone back to the Criterion Hotel and changed into her riding clothes and ridden out to the homestead on a horse she had rented from the livery, a stocky gray mare named Belle who had opinions about everything the same as Agnes Pollard, and she had spent the afternoon walking every inch of the 160 acres and taking notes in a small leather journal. The house her grandfather had built was still standing, though the porch railing had collapsed and several windows had been boarded against weather. The barn was sound. The fencing needed repair, but the posts were solid. The creek ran cold and clear through the southern edge of the property exactly as the survey map showed. She had stood at the edge of the creek in the last of the afternoon light and listened to it run and thought, I am not leaving this, whatever it takes. What it took in the first month was relentless physical labor. Naomi Keller was not a woman who had been bred to softness. Her mother had been a practical woman and her father a working man, and the St. Louis upbringing had included vegetable gardens and laundry and hauling coal, and every other indignity of a life that was comfortable but not easy. She hired one hand, a quiet Tejano man named Cesar Ruiz who had come north with a cattle drive and stayed when the drive moved on, and together they repaired the house, mended the fencing, and planted the kitchen garden. She put in for a small herd of cattle from a sale in Laramie, 10 head to start, enough to demonstrate that the land was being actively worked, which was relevant to the homestead claim. She had been there 3 weeks when she first met Louis Morgan in any meaningful sense. She had seen him before that, of course. Redemption Creek was too small for its residents to remain invisible to one another. Louis Morgan was the kind of man who was impossible not to notice, not because he demanded attention, but because he had the quality of stillness in motion, the way a mountain has presence even when nothing is happening on it. He was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who work outdoors in all weather, with black hair that needed cutting and dark eyes, and a face that had been weathered by sun and Wyoming wind, to a kind of austere handsomeness that he himself appeared entirely unaware of. He ran the Triple M Ranch, 4,000 acres bordering the Keller property to the north, which he had built from a small claim he had purchased 7 years prior and expanded through sheer disciplined effort. He had no family in the county. He had few close friends. He was known to be fair, known to be private, and known to have refused Harlan Voss's attempts to buy him out with a directness that had made Voss dislike him considerably. The first meaningful encounter had happened when one of Louis' steers, a large reddish animal of mixed disposition, had pushed through a weak section of fence near the north boundary of the Keller property and taken up residence in Naomi's pasture near the creek. Naomi had found the animal that morning, driven it firmly back to the gap, and secured the brake with wire she had on hand, and then gone about her day. Louis had arrived that afternoon, riding a big bay horse, and had come to the door of the house and removed his hat. I believe one of my cattle crossed your fence this morning, he said. I apologize. I will have my men ride that line and check the rest of the boundary. Naomi had looked at him steadily. I repaired the breach. You should know it is on your side of the line, so the cost of proper mending is yours. That is correct, and I will see to it. He had paused, his hat held in both hands. You are Elias Keller's granddaughter. I am. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. He was a good neighbor. I was sorry when he passed. Another pause. I heard you have had some difficulty with the land office. I am managing it. I have no doubt of that. He had settled the hat back on his head. If there is anything I can do, I knew Elias. He showed me the records of his filing once years ago. He was proud of having done it properly. Something in Naomi had gone very still at that. He showed you the records. He did. Over supper one winter evening. He was particular about documentation. Said a man's word was his bond, but a man's paper was his armor. Louis had looked out over the pasture. Good afternoon, Miss Keller. He had ridden away, and Naomi had stood in the doorway and turned over what he had said with great care, the way you turn over a stone to see what lives beneath it. Over the following weeks, she had seen him with the regularity that close neighboring properties produce. They had spoken at the General Mercantile, at the church on Sunday where he attended with the consistency of a man who believed, if not with the fervor of one who proclaimed it, and once at the Criterion's small dining room where she had eaten alone and he had eaten at the opposite end, and they had exchanged a nod that somehow contained a full conversation about mutual respect and mutual privacy, and the understanding that neither of them was entirely comfortable with the smallness of this town. She had been asking questions, carefully and quietly, about the witness discrepancy in her grandfather's filing. The man Voss's lawyer alleged had not been a territorial resident at the time of the 1871 signing was a man named James Whitmore, who had since died. What Naomi needed was proof of Whitmore's residency at the time. She had written to the territorial census office. She had searched the church records, which showed a James Whitmore married in Redemption Creek in 1869. She had found a tax record showing a Whitmore paying property tax in 1870. But the 1871 window was the gap, and it was into that gap that Voss's lawyer had inserted his doubt. She had spoken about this to Agnes Pollard one afternoon in May while buying flour and sugar, and Agnes had said, almost as an aside, "You should ask Louis Morgan. He has been here longer than almost anyone. He would have known who was here in 1871. He was barely more than a boy, but he had a good memory, that one." Naomi had thought about that for 3 days before she had ridden north to the Triple M Ranch and knocked on the door of the main house, which was a solid 2-story structure built of pine timber and river stone, with a porch that caught the afternoon sun. Louis had answered the door himself. He had clearly been in the middle of working on something mechanical because there was grease on his right hand, and he wiped it on a cloth he pulled from his pocket before he offered it. "Miss Keller, I need to ask you something," she said, "and I would rather ask you directly than go around the edges of it. Then come in." The inside of his house had surprised her. She had not known what to expect from a man who lived alone and worked constantly, but the house was clean and deliberately ordered, with a large bookshelf along the western wall that held more volumes than most homes she had been in. There was a writing desk near the window, and on it a stack of papers and account ledgers. There was a fireplace with a mantel on which sat a small tin photograph and 2 candles. She noticed all of this in the 3 seconds before she sat down in the chair he pulled out for her, and she noticed that he noticed her noticing. "In 1871, she said without preamble, "do you remember a man named James Whitmore living in this valley?" Something shifted in his eyes. Not surprise. Something closer to recognition, as if he had been expecting this question or something like it for some time. "I do," he said, clearly. "Voss's lawyer claims Whitmore was not a territorial resident at the time my grandfather filed his claim, that Whitmore was passing through." "That is false," Louis said, with a flatness that left no room for qualification. "Whitmore had a small farm 4 miles east of here. I bought a horse from him in the spring of 1871. He had been here since '69. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest that had been clamped very tight. "Can you prove it? Is there any record of the horse transaction?" "I paid him with a bank draft. My father handled our finances through the First Territorial Bank." If those records still exist and territorial banks were required to keep records for 10 years, they would show the date and the payee. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window a crow called twice and fell silent. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, not suspiciously, genuinely. She wanted to understand the man, his motivations, what he stood to gain or lose. "Because it is true," he said simply. "Voss could make things difficult for you." "Voss has been trying to make things difficult for me for 4 years, Louis said. "He has not managed it yet." There was something in the way he said it, not boastful but very calm and very sure, that made Naomi Keller look at Louis Morgan differently than she had before. She had seen composure in men before and recognized it often as performance. This was not performance. This was the real thing, earned through years she had not witnessed. And it was, she admitted only to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts later that evening, one of the most compelling things she had encountered in a considerable time. She had ridden back to the Keller homestead with a direction she had not had that morning, and a warmth in her chest that she was not yet prepared to examine closely. The bank records in Laramie took 3 weeks to retrieve. Louis wrote the letter of request himself, formal and precise, and paid for the courier. Naomi had not asked him to bear the cost, and when she had said so he had said, quietly, that he preferred to handle it. She had not argued, because she recognized when a man was doing something out of principle rather than pity, and this was principle. While they waited, she worked. The cattle had arrived from Laramie, 10 mixed head, and she and Cesar had driven them onto the property and spent a week of long, hot days establishing their grazing rotation. The garden was producing. She had repaired all the fencing on the south boundary herself, post by post, wire strand by strand, working in the mornings before the heat came on. Her hands had gone from soft to calloused in the first month, and she had registered this with satisfaction rather than complaint. She had begun to understand the rhythms of the place that her grandfather had loved enough to file a federal claim on and die here for. The way the light came over the eastern ridge at dawn and turned the creek to copper. The way the meadow in the northwest corner of the property held warmth longer than the rest of the land, and would be good for wintering cattle if she could build a windbreak along its northern edge. The way the creek changed sound between dry weeks and wet ones, dropping from a clear musical conversation to a lower, more serious murmur. She had also begun to understand her neighbors in ways that the early weeks had not allowed. There were families in the valley who had been there since before the railroad, and families who had come after it, and the old ones and the new ones did not always mix without friction. There were 2 families of the Shoshone Nation who had managed to hold small parcels through a combination of federal treaty rights and the personal advocacy of a territorial judge who had since retired, and Naomi had made a point of introducing herself to them with the same courtesy she extended to everyone, which was not the custom among all the white settlers, and which had earned her both respect and some side-eyed wariness from certain quarters of Redemption Creek society. Agnes Pollard had told her bluntly that Harlan Voss had made similar approaches to those families as he had made to Naomi, with similarly unsuccessful results thus far, and that the hidden motive behind Voss's land accumulation was a deal he was allegedly attempting to structure with a railroad spur extension that would, if routed through the valley, make his holdings worth many times their current value. The water rights that ran with the Keller land and the 2 neighboring parcels were critical to any such routing, because the railroad would need a reliable water source for its steam operations. "He is not just greedy," Agnes had said, weighing flour into a paper sack. "He is building toward something specific. That makes him more dangerous than plain greed." Naomi had filed this information away next to the other things she knew about hidden motives and long-range schemes, and the particular ugliness of men who dressed their self-interest in the language of progress and community benefit. She had encountered such men in St. Louis in business contexts, and she recognized the species clearly. It was in June that the dynamic between herself and Louis Morgan had shifted in a way that neither of them had explicitly planned or prepared for. There had been a storm. A real one, the kind the Wyoming territory produced in early summer that combined the ferocity of a winter storm with the heat of a summer one, and created an atmospheric violence that was genuinely frightening if you were new to it. Naomi was relatively new to it. She had gotten her cattle to the barn and her horse to the stable, and Cesar had ridden for the bunkhouse he had set up in the old storage shed. And then the storm had come down in full, and she had been alone in the house, listening to the wind tear at the eaves, and the rain hammer the windows and the thunder peal across the valley in rolling waves that seemed to have no end. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with a candle and her ledger books and her grandfather's surveying journals, which she had found in a trunk in the bedroom, when there had been a pounding at the door. She had opened it to find Louis Morgan, soaked absolutely through, holding his horse's reins and looking as though he had ridden into something he had not anticipated being as bad as it was. "Fence line on the north boundary is down in 3 places," he said, without preamble, because he was that kind of man. "Storm took out a section of my corral, and I came to make sure yours was holding before we had a mixing problem in the morning." "Come in," she said immediately, and he had tied the horse under the porch overhang and stepped into her kitchen and dripped considerably onto the pine floor. She had given him a kitchen towel, and he had dried his face and hands, and stood with his wet hat in his hands, looking as though he was not entirely sure what to do with himself in another person's kitchen in the middle of a night storm. She had put the coffee kettle on, because it was the most sensible thing to do, and she was a sensible woman, and they had sat at either end of the kitchen table with their coffee cups, and the storm had raged outside and they had talked. She had discovered that night that Louis Morgan, who gave very little of himself in public, gave with considerable generosity in private when he trusted the person he was with. He spoke about his early years in the territory, how he had come from Illinois at 22, with a small inheritance from an uncle and a stubborn conviction that land was the only real security a man without family connections could build, and how the first 3 years had been genuinely brutal in the way that frontier building is brutal, not romantic but grinding and cold, and occasionally desperate. He had survived a winter with fever and no doctor within 30 miles. He had lost his first year's calf crop to a blackleg outbreak and rebuilt from almost nothing. He had watched 2 neighboring claims fail and be absorbed by larger operators, and he had made himself into the kind of manager his land required so that would not happen to him. Naomi had listened to this with the full attention of a woman who recognized in another person's struggle something that rhymed with her own, and she had told him, in return, about St. Louis and her parents, and the years of watching them work and watching them die, and the peculiar loneliness of being the last of a family name in a city that did not particularly care about your name. She had told him about finding her grandfather's papers among her father's effects and reading through them, the survey notes and the filing documents and the letters Elias had written back east describing the land in language that was plain and precise but contained, underneath the plainness, a love for the place that was unmistakable. She had told him that reading those letters had decided her. "He said the creek sings," she said, cradling her coffee cup. "In one of the letters. He said it in the middle of a description of fence posts and soil quality, and he seemed almost embarrassed to have said it, because he crossed it out, and then wrote it again in the margin with a small mark beside it, like he had argued with himself about whether to leave it." Louis had looked at her across the kitchen table in the candlelight with the storm loud outside, and something in his expression had changed, become less guarded, more open, the way a window opens in spring after a long closed winter and the new air comes through and the house knows it. "He was right," Louis said. "It does." She had looked back at him, and something between them had acknowledged itself without being spoken, the way certain important things do, and then they had both looked away at approximately the same moment, and the conversation had moved on to practical matters about the fence line. He had stayed until the storm eased near midnight, and then ridden home in the quieter rain, and she had sat at the kitchen table for another hour after he left, not reading and not writing, just sitting. The bank records had arrived from Laramie in the second week of July. They were exactly what Louis had described, a draft dated April 1871, made out to one James Whitmore of Redemption Valley, Wyoming Territory, for the purchase of one gray gelding. The address and the date demolished Voss's lawyers' claim so completely that Naomi had actually laughed when she read it, alone in the land office with Horace Bell looking at her with cautious relief. She had taken the records to the county attorney, a thin, nervous man named Gerald Fitch, who was independently honest enough that Voss had never been able to fully compromise him, but frightened enough of Voss that he moved very slowly on anything that touched the man's interests. The bank record had given Gerald Fitch enough solid ground to stand on that he had written a formal opinion supporting the validity of the Keller claim and delivered it to the town council for their records. Naomi had believed, in the flush of that victory, that the matter was essentially settled. She had been wrong. What she had done, she would come to understand, was not win but rather force Harlan Voss to change tactics, which was considerably more dangerous. August had come in hot and dry, and Voss had begun his second campaign. He had circulated, through his lawyer and through the 2 council members in his pocket, a new challenge based not on the witness residency question, but on a different technicality entirely. He alleged that the Keller homestead had not met the cultivation and improvement requirements of the Homestead Act within the required period, specifically arguing that the years the land sat without active management after Elias Keller's death had constituted abandonment under the terms of the original claim. This was a more sophisticated attack, and it had more genuine legal traction, because there was in fact a provision that could be read, if read with sufficient bad faith, to support the argument. Voss had hired a lawyer from Cheyenne now, not the local man, a sharp-dressed individual named Alcott who wore a city suit and spoke in a way that suggested he had spent considerable time around judges. The council had agreed to hear the formal challenge in September, and that was when the trap had fully revealed itself. Naomi had gone through every legal text she could access, had written to the federal land office in Cheyenne, and had found 2 different interpretations of the abandonment provision. The federal response had been slow and noncommittal, the way federal responses to frontier land disputes typically were when one of the parties was a wealthy man with political connections. She had worked through August almost without stopping, working the land herself, dawn to dusk, to build as strong a case of active improvement and cultivation as she could construct in the time available. Cesar had worked alongside her without complaint. The cattle had increased from 10 to 18 head through natural addition. She had planted winter wheat along the north quarter. She had completed the windbreak she had envisioned for the northwest meadow, 100 yards of young cottonwood and willow set in the ground and staked against the Wyoming wind. And through all of it, Louis Morgan had been there. Not intrusively, not with offers of help that would have felt like charity. But there. He had brought over a fence stretcher she did not have when she needed one and charged her the fair price of the rental. He had told her, with the precise practicality of a man who understood these things, that the winter wheat she was planting would mature early enough to serve as exhibit of active cultivation if the council hearing ran to October. He had mentioned, casually, that Gerald Fitch, the county attorney, had been observed having a long conversation with Voss's Cheyenne lawyer in the back room of the saloon, and that she should factor that into her assessment of where Fitch would stand. He had come to her door one Sunday evening in late August with a folder of papers and said, without ceremony, "I spent the week going through the federal homestead statutes going back to '62. I found 3 case precedents that support your position on the abandonment question." He had spread the papers on her kitchen table and walked her through each one, methodical and clear, and she had sat beside him at the table and followed his reasoning and asked questions, and felt the particular intimacy of 2 minds working closely on something that mattered to both of them. She had said, at the end of that session, "You have spent a great deal of time on this." He had gathered the papers back into their folder without looking at her. "I have." "You did not have to." "No." He had looked at her then, finally, directly. "I wanted to." The silence between them had been different from previous silences. It had held something new and tender and slightly frightening. "Louis," she had said, and then had not said the next thing because she did not know quite how to say it, because she was a woman who was careful with the things that mattered, and this was beginning to matter. "I know," he had said quietly, and had stood and put on his hat and said good night and walked out into the August dark, and she had watched the door close behind him and pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table and steadied herself. She had not slept well that night or for several nights after, not from worry about the land, though she worried about that, from something else entirely, something that lived in the chest and made everything simultaneously clearer and more complicated. September had come in, and with it, the formal notice of the council hearing, set for September 19th. Naomi had spent the first 2 weeks of the month preparing her case with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that she was going into a room where the odds were arranged against her, and the only weapons she had were truth and preparation and stubbornness. She had organized her documents. She had written a formal statement. She had requested supporting testimony from Agnes Pollard regarding the long public knowledge of the Keller claim. She had written to a federal land office examiner in Cheyenne requesting his attendance, knowing he would likely not come, but wanting the request on record. She had not asked Louis Morgan to appear. She had not done so because she understood, with the clarity of a woman who thought carefully about the people in her life, that what he had already done for her was significant, and that what she had asked and what he had given were already at the edge of what could be asked of a neighbor, however close. To ask him to stand before the council was to ask him to put himself publicly in the path of Harlan Voss's displeasure in a way that went beyond the bank record and the legal research, a way that would be personal and visible and consequential. She had not asked. She had intended to stand alone. She had not been alone. The hearing had opened at 2 in the afternoon on September 19th, and the town hall had filled beyond its comfortable capacity, because Redemption Creek was a small place, and this was large drama, and everyone had opinions about it. Voss's lawyer Alcott had presented for 40 minutes, eloquent and precise and skilled in the way of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly where the legal weight was softest. He had painted a picture of an abandoned claim, land left to go to seed, the ghost of an old man's good intentions rotting in the Wyoming sun, while his granddaughter sat in St. Louis unaware and unconcerned. Naomi had sat in the front row through all of it and breathed evenly and made notes on a small pad, and not shown by so much as the line of her mouth what it cost her to hear her grandfather's legacy described that way. She had presented her case afterward. She had shown the cultivation records, the cattle tallies, the bank records from Laramie, the legal precedents she had found. She had been clear and organized and calm, and she had, toward the end, allowed one thing through the composure. She had looked at the council and said, "My grandfather built this land with his hands and his belief and his sweat and his years. He filed that claim properly, and he worked it faithfully until his body would not let him any more. I came here to finish what he started, and I have done everything this law requires. I am asking you to see what is in front of you, and not what Harlan Voss wants you to see." The council chairman had looked at his papers and cleared his throat and opened his mouth, and the doors had opened instead. Louis Morgan had walked to the front of that room. He had set the document on the council table, and he had said the words that would ring in that room for a long time afterward. Her grandfather filed that claim, and it stands today. The room had erupted. Voss had come to his feet. Alcott had spoken sharply about procedural rules. 3 different people in the gallery had begun talking at once. The chairman had hammered his gavel. Louis had stood in the center of all of it without moving. His eyes had found Naomi's for one moment, and in that moment something passed between them that was not a secret anymore, that was not something tender and slightly frightening, that was something decided, something resolved, something as clear and cold and real as the creek running through the south pasture. He turned back to the council, and he did not raise his voice or lose a single degree of his composure, but what he said next came out of him with a force that was not anger but conviction. And conviction, Naomi had always believed, was louder than anger. "I will tell you what is in that document," he said. "It is a sworn affidavit from Gerald Fitch, county attorney, attesting that the Keller homestead claim meets every requirement of the Federal Homestead Act as filed and subsequently maintained. You will notice the date on that affidavit. It is from 2 months ago, before Mr. Voss's lawyer persuaded Mr. Fitch that his professional opinion might be subject to revision." He paused. It is a little harder to revise a sworn and witnessed affidavit than a professional opinion. I had a copy made when Gerald handed it to me for safekeeping, which he apparently no longer remembers doing. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the first one. This one had shame in it, and fear, and the particular sound of a scheme falling apart at the structural level. Harlan Voss looked at Louis Morgan with an expression that contained a promise of future hostility, so naked It was almost remarkable in its lack of subtlety. Alcott was writing furiously on his notepad. The council members were looking at each other with the expressions of men who had been about to do something they would now have to find a way not to do. The chairman looked at Gerald Fitch, who was seated in the gallery and had gone the color of old ash. Fitch said nothing. He was, in this moment, saying nothing as loudly as he had ever said anything in his life. The chairman looked at the document. He looked at Voss. He looked at Alcott. He looked at Naomi. He looked, finally, at the gallery of Redemption Creek residents who had come to watch, and who were watching with the attentiveness of people who would remember what they saw here for the rest of their lives. "The council will recess for deliberation," he said. They were gone for 22 minutes. The town hall buzzed and shifted like a disturbed hive. Voss sat in his seat with his jaw set and spoke to no one. Alcott circulated through the gallery, speaking quietly to men Naomi did not know. Agnes Pollard, seated directly behind Naomi, put her hand briefly on Naomi's shoulder and said nothing, which was notable coming from Agnes. Louis had taken a seat beside Naomi while the council was out. He had sat very straight, looking ahead, his hat on his knee, and she had been aware of the entire length of him beside her the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, as presence and warmth simultaneously. "You did not tell me you were coming," she said very quietly. "No. Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, equally quietly, "Because I was not sure you would let me." She had looked at her hands in her lap and felt the impossible complexity of what she felt in that moment, the gratitude and the relief and the furious warm thing underneath all of it that was not gratitude at all. "You were right that I might have said no," she admitted. "I know." A pause. "That is why." The council came back in and took their seats, and the chairman looked at the room with the expression of a man who has made a decision he will have to live with, and is not certain he chose correctly, but is choosing it regardless, which is the best that can be said about many human decisions. "This council finds the challenge to the Keller homestead claim without sufficient merit," he said. "The original filing made by Elias Keller in 1871 is recognized as valid and standing. The claim passes to his heir, Naomi Keller, in full accordance with the terms of the original grant. This matter is closed." Harlan Voss stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Alcott followed him. Two of the gallery men who had been speaking with Alcott followed as well, with the particular hurry of men who had bet on a horse that had not placed. The rest of the room had a very different reaction. Naomi had stood and turned to face the gallery, and accepted the congratulations of her neighbors with the composure that had carried her through the hearing. But she was aware, acutely and continuously aware, of Louis standing just behind her to her left, and of the fact that Agnes Pollard had immediately taken both his hands and said something to him with an expression of fierce approval that would have been comical if it was not so genuinely touching. They had walked out of the town hall together in the late September afternoon light, and the street had been busy with people coming and going and talking, and none of them were looking directly at Naomi and Louis, but all of them were aware of them, because Redemption Creek was that kind of town. She had stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for the affidavit, for coming, for all of it." He had looked at her with those dark eyes in the September light. And then he had done something she had not expected from a man who was as private and contained as he was. He had reached out and taken her hand, there on the public boardwalk of Redemption Creek's Main Street, and held it for a moment that was longer than courtesy required and shorter than everything she felt, and he had said, very simply, "You are welcome, Naomi." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had let the moment breathe around them for as long as it could before the pragmatic world reasserted itself in the form of Agnes Pollard arriving at her elbow to make a recommendation about supper at the Criterion's dining room, and Louis had released her hand, and the world had continued, but it continued differently than it had before. The weeks that followed the council hearing had a different quality to them. The tension of the legal fight was gone, and in its place was the softer and in some ways more demanding tension of two people who had declared something through action and now had to decide what to do about it in words. Harlan Voss had not disappeared. He was still in Redemption Creek and still owned his 12,000 acres and still sat on the county council through his bought members. And the defeat at the hearing had not made him smaller or quieter, but rather had made him more careful and more cold. He had stopped making open moves against Naomi's land, but she knew better than to believe the ambition behind those moves had evaporated. Agnes Pollard had heard through her considerable network of information that Voss had written to the railroad company proposing an alternative route that avoided the Keller property and the neighboring parcels, one that would require acquiring a stretch of land from a family named Hartwell who were in financial difficulty and might be persuaded. If that route worked for the railroad, Voss's interest in the Keller water rights would diminish substantially, and Naomi would be safe by irrelevance rather than by victory, which was fine. She would take it. But the matter of Harlan Voss, while not fully resolved, had moved to a longer and less immediate horizon, and what had moved to the immediate foreground was Louis Morgan, and the fact that they were two people who had somehow, in the middle of a land dispute and a legal fight and the daily grinding work of frontier ranching, fallen into something that had the weight and the warmth and the irreversibility of falling. He had come to help her repair the windbreak in October, riding over with two of his hands and a wagon of additional stakes, and they had worked all day in the cool October air and eaten lunch, sitting on the tailgate of the wagon with tin plates of bread and cold beef that she had packed, and his hands had come in from a different direction and given them a privacy that was either deliberate or coincidental and was welcome regardless. He had said, looking out across the northwest meadow at the young cottonwoods standing in their lines, "This is going to be good ground in 10 years. It is good ground now," she had said. He had looked at her sideways with something that was almost a smile, which was rare enough on his face to be notable. "You sound like your grandfather. I take that as a considerable compliment." The almost smile had become an actual one, brief and warm, and entirely different from his usual expression in the way a fire is different from the stone of the fireplace it burns in. She had stored that smile away with the care she gave to things that mattered. He had asked her, with the straightforward awkwardness of a man who was not practiced at this kind of asking, if she would take supper with him the following Saturday at the Criterion, not as neighbors. He had said, with a slight stiffness that indicated he had been composing this speech for some time and was not entirely happy with how it was coming out, but as something else. He had left the definition of the something else open, which she suspected was not accidental. She had said yes without hesitation, and then looked back at the cottonwoods, because looking at him directly at that moment would have been too much. They had gone to supper at the Criterion and talked for 3 hours across a corner table in the small dining room while the owner, a bearded man named Cartwright, pretended not to be watching them with immense personal interest. They had talked about books, because Louis had read more than she expected and had opinions about what he read, careful and well-considered opinions. And she had opinions that were considerably less careful, and he had found this funny in the way of a man who genuinely appreciates the surprise of another person's mind. They had talked about what they each wanted, practically and concretely, from the land and the future, and had discovered that their visions were not identical, but were compatible in the way that two different building materials are compatible when they reinforce each other's weaknesses. Walking back from the Criterion in the October dark, she had slipped on the boardwalk where a loose board had worked up an edge, and his hand had come out and caught her arm with such immediate sureness, before she had even processed the stumble, and he had not let go right away, and she had not moved away right away, and they had stood for a moment in the lamplight spilling from the hotel window with his hand on her arm and the October wind moving between them, and then he had kissed her. Brief and careful, and with everything he had not been able to say directly present in the doing of it, and she had kissed him back the same way. It had been the beginning, formally, of something that had been beginning in practice for months. The winter of 1879 into 1880 had been hard by Wyoming standards, which meant it was genuinely savage. The temperature had dropped to places that made steel brittle and breath into ice, and the wind had come down from the north with a commitment that was almost personal. Naomi had lost 2 cattle to the cold in January, which was painful, and the creek had frozen solid from late December through March, which had meant hauling water for the animals from a spring further up the property that stayed open. She had done this with Cesar and without complaint, and had emerged in April of 1880 feeling that she had passed some essential test that the land was required to set for anyone who wanted to live on it seriously. Louis had been through the winter before on his own ranch and had prepared her in their late autumn conversations for what to expect, what to lay in, what to do and not do with the cattle in extreme cold. This practical guidance had been given with the matter-of-fact directness he applied to everything, but she had heard underneath it the thing he was not saying directly, which was that he cared what happened to her and to her land, and was doing what he could at the boundary of what was appropriate to do when you were not yet the person who had the full right to protect someone. They had spent time together through the winter in the limited ways that extreme cold permits, Sunday dinners alternately at the Keller homestead and the Triple M, evenings by the fire with books and conversation, and the growing ease of 2 people who have decided to be honest with each other about who they are. He had told her about a dark year in his early 20s when the ranch had nearly failed, and he had come very close to giving it up, the despair of that period, the sense of having chosen wrongly and being too stubborn to admit it. She had told him about the grief after her parents' deaths, how it had operated on her like a slow freeze rather than a sudden storm, how she had functioned perfectly well on the surface for a year before it had finally caught up with her one February night in St. Louis when she had sat in her rented room and understood that she was entirely alone in the world. I decided then, she had told him, that alone was a fact, not a sentence. That it did not have to define the shape of everything. He had looked at her across his fireplace in November with something in his eyes that was so unguarded it had taken her breath. "You were right," he had said. "It does not." He had asked her to marry him in March of 1880, just as the first suggestion of spring was beginning to show in the way the light changed at midday. He had done it properly, not on one knee which would have struck both of them as theatrical, but sitting at the kitchen table of the Keller homestead over coffee, which was where so much of what mattered between them had happened, and he had said with his characteristic directness that she had come to love as one of the most genuine things about him. "I want to marry you, Naomi. I would like to know if that is something you want as well." She had said, matching his directness precisely, "Yes. That is something I want." He had reached across the table and taken her hand, and they had sat for a while in the way of people who have arrived somewhere important and do not want to rush away from the arriving. They were married in June of 1880 at the Redemption Creek Church, on a morning when the valley was green, and the creek was running at its fullest, and the wild roses along the south fence of the Keller property were in bloom. Agnes Pollard had organized the reception with a ferocious competence that no one had attempted to restrain. Cesar Ruiz had stood up with Louis, which had surprised some people in Redemption Creek, and surprised neither Louis nor Naomi, who had both recognized in Cesar a man of quality who had earned that position through 2 years of loyal and excellent work. The minister, a young man named Dobbs who had replaced the previous pastor 2 months prior, had conducted the service with genuine warmth and had been thoroughly interrogated by Agnes afterward about every element of it. Naomi had worn a dress of blue-green wool that she had made herself over the winter months, stitching it in the evenings, a choice that Louis had understood completely when she told him about it afterward, that she had wanted to wear something she had made, not borrowed or bought, something that was hers. It was beautiful, he had said, and she had known he meant it as both an aesthetic observation and something larger. They had merged the two properties in practice, if not immediately in title. The Keller homestead and the Triple M running as a single operation, with Naomi taking on the bookkeeping and herd management she had a genuine talent for, alongside the direct daily work of cattle ranching that she had made herself capable of through 2 solid years of learning. They had 2 sets of hands now, Cesar and 2 additional men Louis had hired in the spring, and the combined operation was considerably more efficient and financially sound than either property had been separately. Harlan Voss had attended the wedding, which had surprised nearly everyone except Agnes Pollard, who said she had seen it coming because men of Voss's type always made social appearances at their enemies' celebrations to demonstrate that they bore no grudge, which was itself a demonstration that they absolutely did. He had congratulated them with a politeness that had no warmth in it and departed early. The railroad alternate route had apparently been progressing well enough that the Keller water rights were no longer the object of active scheming, though Louis had made sure through Gerald Fitch, who had become something of a remorseful ally in the months after the hearing, that all the property documentation was in impeccable order and filed at multiple levels of the recording system. Harlan Voss was diminished in the county's estimation by the outcome of the hearing, not destroyed. A man of his resources was not destroyed by one failure, but diminished. 2 council members who had been in his pocket had faced sufficient social pressure from their constituents that they had quietly renegotiated their loyalties in the direction of independence. The valley was not free of his influence, but it was less wholly under it, and that was a genuine change. In the autumn of 1880, Naomi had become certain she was expecting their first child. She had told Louis on a Sunday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee in the early light, and he had gone very still in the way he went still when something reached past his composure to the core of him. And then he had come around the table and taken her face in his hands very carefully, as if she were something to be handled with the greatest possible attention, and he had kissed her forehead, and then held her with both arms, and she had felt his breathing change against her hair. "Are you frightened?" he had asked, which was not the first thing most men would have asked and was exactly the right thing. "A little," she had said honestly. "Are you?" "Considerably," he had said, and she had laughed and felt his arms tighten around her in response to the laugh. Their son had been born in the spring of 1881, delivered by the doctor who had ridden out from Redemption Creek in April with the full complement of his skills and his bag, and Agnes Pollard, who had inserted herself into the proceedings on the grounds that the doctor was a sensible man, but had never personally birthed a child, and Agnes had, and the doctor had been sufficiently pragmatic to accept this argument. The boy had been born healthy and loud on a morning when the spring rain was coming down outside, and the creak was audible from the bedroom window. Louis had named him Elias for Naomi's grandfather, and the choosing of that name had undone Naomi completely in a way that the birth itself, endured with remarkable composure, had not. She had wept properly and thoroughly for the first time in a very long time, and Louis had held her through it and said nothing, because he understood by now that she did not want or need words in those moments, only presence. Young Elias Morgan had grown, in the way of healthy frontier babies, with remarkable speed. He was a solid, good-natured child who slept well and ate with enthusiasm, and appeared to have inherited his father's quality of stillness in motion, the ability to observe everything without demanding the observation be noticed. He was also, by his 2nd year, showing signs of his mother's stubbornness, which Louis regarded with the particular expression of a man who is amused and mildly alarmed in equal measure. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was milder than the previous one, and the property had its best financial year yet. The cattle operation had expanded to 60 head, and the winter wheat had been a strong crop. Louis had taken on an additional pasture on the north edge of his original claim, purchased from a homesteader who had decided the frontier life was not what he had imagined it from Indiana, and the combined property now ran to nearly 600 acres, a real ranch in the language of the territory, not a small claim anymore but something that would carry forward. In the spring of 1882, they had discovered that Naomi was expecting again, and she had told him this time in a different way, over supper with Elias banging happily on the table with a wooden spoon, and Louis had looked at her across the table and smiled fully and freely in a way that she had collected every instance of over the years and held very carefully. "Another one," he had said. "Another one," she had confirmed. "Good," he had said simply, and reached over and taken the wooden spoon from Elias before it damaged something, and handed him a biscuit instead. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara after Louis's mother, whom Naomi had never met but had heard enough about to feel she knew, arrived in October of 1882, small and fierce, and entirely uninterested in sleeping at the hours her parents found convenient. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, and she operated from her first weeks with a decisiveness about what she wanted that made everyone around her work harder and smile more. The ranch had continued to grow through those years in the way that is possible when two capable people are pointed in the same direction and working without competing against each other. Louis had found that Naomi's approach to cattle management, which she had developed from scratch over 3 years, had innovations he had not considered because she had come to the work without the assumptions of a man who had been doing it since boyhood. She had found that his understanding of the land, the weather, the particular personalities of the Wyoming seasons, was an education that no book or letter could have provided, and that she absorbed eagerly and applied practically. Cesar Ruiz had married a woman from Laramie named Paya in the summer of 1882 and built a proper small house on the eastern edge of the property, where the original storage shed had stood, and the 4 adults and their respective children had formed the kind of community that grows up naturally on working land when the people involved have decided to trust each other. Agnes Pollard had come out to the Morgan Ranch for Sunday dinners with a frequency that eventually required Louis to build her a proper chair at the table, which he had done without comment, and with a workmanship that made Agnes inspect it with enormous satisfaction before she sat in it. By the spring of 1884, the news had come through proper channels, confirmed by the federal land surveyor who had finally made the journey out from Cheyenne, that the Keller homestead claim was fully adjudicated and recorded in the Federal Register without any pending challenges. Naomi had held the final certification document for a long moment, standing at the kitchen table where so much of the story had unfolded, and then she had set it carefully in the tin document box she kept for important papers, next to her grandfather's original survey journals, and gone about her day. Louis had watched her do this from the doorway. He had come in quietly and said nothing for a moment, and then he had said, "How does it feel?" She had considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. "Like something that was always true has been recognized," she said, "which is satisfying, though the recognition should have been unnecessary." "He would be proud of you," Louis said. "Your grandfather." She had looked at her husband in the morning light coming through the kitchen window and felt the complicated and entirely good thing that she felt regularly in his presence, the sense of being fully known and fully chosen, which was the particular gift of a love built slowly and honestly between two people who had both learned what it was to stand alone and had chosen, clearly and repeatedly, not to. "Come here," she had said, and he had crossed the kitchen and she had put her arms around him and held on, and he had held back with the absolute steadiness that was his particular and most beloved quality. And outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming spring was making its reliable and irreversible progress, and Elias was running in the yard, and Clara was sitting in the dirt investigating something she had found with the focused intensity she brought to everything. The land itself had been what started it, the claim and the fight and the legal trap that Voss had built and Louis had helped her dismantle. But the land was also what they worked every day and what they would pass forward, and what connected them to something larger than themselves. To Elias Keller, who had stood in this valley in 1871, with his surveying chain and his belief. To Clara Morgan's memory in a small tin photograph on a distant mantel. To everything that had come before and the long shape of what was still ahead. In the summer of 1884, Louis had found the time, in the evenings after the children were sleeping, to finish a project he had been building in pieces for most of a year. He had replaced the collapsed porch railing on the original Keller homestead house, which they used now as the primary family house, and had built it wider and sturdier than the original, with a bench along the western end where you could sit and watch the sun go down behind the mountains and the light change on the creek below. He had not told Naomi he was doing it until it was done, and one evening in July he had simply said after supper, "Come outside." She had come out and seen it and stood looking at it for a long moment. "The railing was the first thing I noticed when I came out here that first day," she said. "That first afternoon, I made a note in my journal that it needed repair." "I know," he said. "You told me that some time ago." She had turned and looked at him. "You remembered that." "I remember most things you tell me," he said, with the plain directness that still, after 4 years, had the capacity to reach her in places she had not known could be reached. They had sat on the new bench together in the July evening, and watched the light change on the mountains and the creek catch and lose and catch again the last of the day's gold, and the children were in bed, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the ranch was quiet around them in the way. A working place is quiet at the end of a full day. A silence that is not empty but full of everything that has been done and everything that waits to be done, and the good simple fact of being alive in the middle of it. "I want to tell you something," Louis said, looking at the mountains. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words carefully, which with him meant they would be worth waiting for. "When I came into that town hall in September," he said, "I had thought about it for 2 weeks, every reason I should not do it, every reason it was not my matter to get involved in. I made a considerable list. And none of it changed what I was going to do," he said, "which was when I understood that the list was irrelevant." He turned and looked at her in the last of the evening light, and his face was open in the way it was open only for her, without the reserve that was not coldness but privacy, the deep privacy of a man who had learned to guard himself in a world that had not always rewarded openness. "You mattered to me already, before I knew how much. The list was irrelevant from the beginning." Naomi Keller Morgan looked at her husband in the evening light on the porch her grandfather had built, and she thought about the word betrayal, and how she had been afraid before Louis, that love was something that ultimately involved it, that the vulnerability of it was a kind of trap set for people who were not careful enough. She had been careful. She had not been wrong to be careful. But she had also not been wrong to set the carefulness aside when the right thing presented itself. And here was the right thing sitting beside her on a summer evening with his weathered hands on his knees and his dark eyes on her with an expression that contained no hidden motive, no dark past obscuring the present, no secret running underneath the surface. Only this, only them, only the land that had brought them to each other and the life they had built on it together. "The list was irrelevant," she said, "because you had already decided." "Yes, so had I," she said. "I just did not know it yet." He reached over and took her hand, there on the porch in the July evening, the same way he had taken it on the boardwalk of Redemption Creek on the day the council had ruled in her favor, with the same unhurried certainty and the same completeness. They sat together as the last light left the mountains and the creek settled into its evening sound, and the stars began to appear above the Wyoming plain, that enormous sky, that deep and permanent dark punctured with light, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to need to say about it. The creek sang, as it always had, as Elias Keller had written in a letter 80 miles east that his granddaughter had carried 2,000 miles west to the place it described, and it sang now as it had then, and as it would after both of them were gone, carrying the cold mountain water through the south pasture of the land that bore the Keller name in the Federal Register, and the Morgan name on the deed, and both names together on the children sleeping inside. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek grew. The railroad spur did eventually come through the valley, following the alternate route, and the town that had been 300 souls became 600, and then more. A school was built in 1885, a proper one with 2 rooms and a stove that worked, and Naomi served on its founding board alongside Agnes Pollard, who remained as formidably involved in everything as she had ever been. The Double V Ranch changed hands in 1886 when Harlan Voss's health failed and his sons, having none of their father's appetite for acquisition and all of his capacity for spending, sold the operation in pieces to neighboring ranchers. A portion of it went to Louis Morgan at a fair market price, expanding the Morgan spread further north and giving them the kind of operational scale that made the winter seasons genuinely survivable rather than merely endurable. Gerald Fitch had eventually made his own kind of peace with the events of the council hearing. He was not a bad man who had done a bad thing without remorse. He was a frightened man who had done a bad thing, which was worse in some ways and more recoverable in others. He had been privately honest with Naomi about his role, in a conversation one afternoon in his office that had cost him considerable dignity, and had earned him something more durable than dignity in return. She had thanked him for the affidavit, the original one that Louis had preserved, and she had said she hoped the experience had been instructive and left it there, because she had inherited from her grandfather not only the land, but the understanding that a man who has acknowledged a mistake is generally more useful as an ally than as an enemy. Elias Morgan, growing from sturdy toddler to serious-faced boy with his father's stillness and his mother's eyes, had begun accompanying Louis on the morning rounds of the ranch property by his 5th year, riding on the front of the saddle, and had acquired by his 6th an opinion about cattle management that he delivered with confidence. Clara Morgan had by the same age decided that the creek was the most interesting thing on the property, and had to be supervised near it with a diligence that kept everyone on their toes. In the winter of 1886, Naomi had told Louis they were expecting a 3rd child, and he had received this news at the kitchen table, which remained the site of all significant communications in their house by long-standing habit, with the full warmth that by now he showed freely, not only in private but in the general world of their life together, the reserve having gradually over the years opened into something more accessible without losing its depth. Their 2nd son, born in the summer of 1887, they named James, for James Whitmore, whose bank record had helped save the claim. This was Naomi's idea, and Louis had agreed immediately, understanding exactly what she meant by it, that the threads of the story deserved to be acknowledged, that the past that had brought them here was not separate from the present but woven through it. James Morgan was born in the same room where Elias had been born and Clara after him, in the house that Elias Keller the elder had built in 1871, the same year he had filed the claim that had stood through all the challenges brought against it, that stood now and had always stood, a fact the land itself seemed to understand in the way land understands the things that are built on it with real intention. The porch bench that Louis had built faced west, and in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in or near the house, and the creek was singing in the south pasture, and the Wyoming sky was doing what Wyoming skies do at the end of a day, which is among the most beautiful things a human eye can be offered. Naomi and Louis would sit together on that bench with their coffee or without it and watch the light go, and let the silence do what silence does between 2 people who have long since finished needing to prove anything to each other. The claim stood. The land was theirs. The children were growing into themselves with the particular confidence of people who have been rooted somewhere genuinely and loved without qualification, and given work that means something, which is everything a person needs to begin. The creek sang through the south pasture as it always had, and as it would continue to do after all of them. And the mountains to the west turned copper and rose, and finally a deep purple in the last of the light before the dark came down soft and full of stars. There was a moment, one evening in the autumn of 1887, when Naomi had sat on the bench with James asleep in her arms and watched Louis walk back from the barn with Elias on his shoulders and Clara running beside him. And the light was that particular copper color, and the air smelled of autumn grass and cold coming, and the creek was audible in the near distance. And everything that had happened to bring her to this exact point in this exact place had assembled itself in her mind with the clarity that comes sometimes at the end of a long, hard road when you turn and look back and see for the first time the whole shape of the journey. She had come west alone with 2 trunks and a deed, and a stubbornness she had inherited from a grandfather she had never stood on this land with. She had walked into a legal fight with a man who had considered the matter essentially settled before she arrived. She had found, in the neighbor to the north who had remembered her grandfather's papers and preserved a county attorney's affidavit and walked through the doors of a town hall on a September afternoon, something she had not been looking for and had not planned on and would not have traded for anything in the world. Louis had come up to the porch with Elias still on his shoulders and Clara holding his hand, and he had looked at her on the bench with the sleeping baby, and he had seen on her face whatever was on her face in that moment, because he always saw what was on her face in moments like this, and he had lifted Elias carefully down from his shoulders and set him on the porch, and then he had sat beside her and looked at her and not said anything because he did not need to. She had leaned her head against his shoulder the way she did sometimes in the evenings when they were alone, and he had put his arm around her carefully so as not to disturb the baby, and they had watched the light go together, and the children had settled onto the porch boards around them with the practicality of children who are simply where their parents are and find that sufficient, and the creek sang in the south pasture, and the stars came out above Wyoming, and the claim stood, and it stood today. And it would stand as long as there was a Morgan to work it, and a Keller name in the Federal Register, and a bench on a western-facing porch, where 2 people who had found each other through stubbornness and legal records and a storm-soaked kitchen and an open set of doors could sit at the end of a full day and know, without needing to say it, that they had built something true, something that would last, something worth every battle it had taken to keep.